Welcome back to Inside the Box. I'm your host, Joanna Lee, and we are in the fourth episode of our Canada Day series. Today's guest is a true Canadian patriot of the arts. Born in Canada's capital, he is a brilliant violinist, educator, and a world advocate for disability and the arts. He has been featured on major networks such as CTV, CBC, City TV, and YTV. His debut orchestral performance was with the Toronto Symphony, and he has performed with top orchestras internationally. He has been nominated for a Juno, received the CBC Galaxy Rising Star Award, and in 2008, he was inducted to the Terry Fox Hall of Fame. It is my absolute pleasure to present the amazing Adrian Anantawan. Welcome, Adrian. It is so great to have you here.
Thank you. It's lovely to connect digitally and to hear all about inside the box. I always think about this idea of thinking outside the box and the idea of like a jack in the box and just the springing of ideas. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me as well. I wanted to start off with your origin story and how you got to where you are today musically.
Like everyone's origin story, I think it really does start from birth. And I was born in Ottawa, and I have a disability, so I was born without my right hand over here. And doctors theorized the umbilical cord wrapped around my hand and kept it from growing. So I still have 5 fingers here, but they're just in very early stages of development, as they say. And I think that my parents were especially worried when I was born about the perception that the rest of my family would have, and in particular my grandmother. And as a baby, we flew down to Hong Kong, where my grandmother is from, and my mom presented me to her for the first time. So in the Chinese culture and like the folklorist culture of a lot of different places, disability can be seen as a curse or this repayment of these past sins by earlier generations. But my grandmother looked at me for the first time and said, well, he cries like any baby and he laughs like any baby. He probably just needs a little bit of exercise. So she went to the marketplace and was looking for a toy for me to play with. And since I'm here in my room, I actually have it here. It's a small bracelet that has a couple bells attached to it. And the idea was that when I was rolling around, shaking all my limbs in the crib, she would put it on this hand and say I was shaking my left hand, nothing would happen to my legs. But if I shook this, it would make this interesting jingle sound, and supposedly as a young baby I could do this for hours, thus developing my biceps, according to my grandmother. So in some ways I feel like this is the origin of my musical story as well. This is my first instrument more than 30 years ago now. And I think that it's sort of led me up to being able to play the violin to this day, not only because this is a musical instrument, but it represents this belief from my grandmother especially, that she was able to see me as a person first rather than societal conventions saw me. And when you start with that belief, there are a lot of things that really impact the ceiling of our development and potential as a result.
Your grandmother sounds lovely, and it seems like you could give her credit for developing your bow arm.
Yeah, I would say so. There's like definitely a lot of energy that is required to sort of move the bow across a violin string, and the tools become more and more complex, and yet I would like to almost say like the spirit of how we sort of have this need to express ourselves through these tools doesn't really change. And I was very lucky to not only have the support of my grandmother, but my parents growing up, and and a lot of other organizations in Canada that was able to, or that were able to support my development as a young musician with a exterior disability.
That's wonderful and really important to have, especially, in any given situation. Your family support is one of the most important, especially as a musician.
Absolutely. They're your first support networks, and everything sort of grows from there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I've seen you in a commercial where you were playing Vinyasa violin concerto.
Yeah, that was for the War Amps, and this was probably done almost 15 years ago now, when I was still in high school and on my way to the Curtis Institute of Music. So it was for an organization called the War Amps, nonprofit based in Ottawa with national scale, and it was founded after the World Wars by Canadian veterans who were looking to support artificial limbs for those who had lost them during the wars. And eventually, they expanded their mission to be able to help young amputees, child amputees, have different recreational limbs, some that the government wouldn't necessarily approve through insurance. So they called the CHAMP program, so child amputee, and they sort of cover the costs for families so that we're allowed to experiment with adaptations, refine them, and create tools to be able to allow us to maximize our expression.
Absolutely, and expression is incredibly important. What would you say your style is as a musician?
I think that the style is so much about understanding the aesthetics of what has come before us and sort of where we are now. I think that I'm very influenced by some early recordings from 30, 40 years ago, the golden age of the violin, as they say. And these are the times of violinists like Jascha Heifetz, Jeanette Neveu, David Oistra, Nathan Milstein, sort of giants in their fields, and whose recordings sort of persevere to this day. They had a very organic, individual way of playing the instrument. No one sounded exactly the same, which is why they call it the Golden Age, because there's just such a variety and treasure trove of different sonic fingerprints that you could attach your ears to if you were hearing a piece by Bach, for instance, but it was just done in such a idiosyncratic way. So I definitely have attention to that, and then there's like sort of the more modern school, and this is very generalized, of course. Modern school of violin, where you're really clinically examining composition in a way that takes a little bit of the individuality out, so the composer can come through as well. And there are some great modern violinists who have been able to do that type of work. Anthony Marwood, for instance, from Norwegian Chamber Orchestra, doing great work. You see like sort of classics like Hilary Hahn, for instance, very pristine, calculated playing, and there's value to all of it in the end. So I think it really is a different balance for everyone. I like to sort of stay in between, and really depends on what piece I'm playing as well. If something calls for sort of a more romantic bel canto sort of singing approach, then I'll sort of change my aesthetic to sort of suit that need. So just like a painter can sort of work with different mediums or different palettes, I think it's the same with musicians. It's great to be able to sort of recognize something for one's own work, and at the same time have something that feels informed and contemporary at the same time.
Absolutely, and I can certainly attest to your style being very closely related to the Golden Age. I think it's beautiful, and more people should go ahead and listen to the Golden Age recordings.
And they're all available on YouTube now, so it's like You don't even have to go to the library. These things are so accessible.
Definitely. Or you can even stream if you have Spotify or Apple Music.
Exactly. Yeah. So a treasure trove, and not to say that LPs are out. Like I think LPs are in now. So
Definitely.
the originals are always fun. The warmth of the sound. But
Yes.
I don't do that at this point. But I would like to at some point.
Well, I should lend you my Fritz Kreisler recording one day.
I'd love to listen to it.
For sure. Now, as a Canadian who went to the top schools in the States, what was it like, and would you do it the same way all over again under the current political climate?
Yeah, I think that the relationship between Canada and the United States has always been one of the friendly neighbor, and I think that during my time growing up, this is sort of like the time of this concern, at least, of the brain drain of all these Canadians going down to the States to get their education. And I think that's very different now. I mean, not to say that the Canadian universities were never great to begin with, but just the reputation of like being able to stay at home and contribute to your community is appealing, and I definitely would have considered that. At least in like these days, especially like United States tuition is extremely high, and Canadian universities have a lot to offer to Canadians specifically. That being said, I don't know if I would actually change it. It's good to be uncomfortable, and there is like a real sense of like the Curtis Institute or Yale or Harvard not only being like great universities for the States, but just like an opportunity that all world citizens would probably want to try to take at some point. But it definitely was a privilege, and there are still many ways and that I'm trying to think of how I can continue using those privileges, not only to help American arts and culture and society, but also up in Canada as well.
That's wonderful to hear. I think that, being a descendant of Canadian education or a graduate of Canadian education, I would have liked to experience the States.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that are going on in both countries that we have to attend to socially. I mean, we hear these huge, divides and stories about the systematic racism and inequities in race with America, and Canada can't really escape that as well to a certain extent, but it might take on a very sort of slightly different form as well. But all that being said, I think there is hopefully sort of this fluidity to being able to navigate both countries and in a way that we can help each other. Some of the great work that is happening in Canada, I hope, influences the American political system and vice versa as well. And that really is a continual dialogue, and one that I think that as we sort of see sort of the world and nations become more insular, I hope that Canada and the United States especially remain open as partners and collaborators as much as we can.
That would be wonderful, especially during this time.
Absolutely.
Speaking of diversity, you've had a culturally diverse audience throughout your musical career. What was it like to play for the White House, Paralympics, Vancouver Winter Games, the Pope, Christopher Reeves, and the Dalai Lama?
So I think that the diversity of audiences can very easily become overwhelming in terms of scale. So say for instance you're playing at the Olympics and you're like in a stadium of like 60,000 people or something like that. As a classical musician, you're usually playing for a much smaller audience. So what do you do to continue to create impact, and how do you still feel connected to everyone? And I think after sort of just having, again, like these amazing privileges and opportunities to play in these types of events, it really is about retaining who you are and still letting the audience come to you. If you try to reach out too far, I feel like in some ways you dilute whatever you're trying to send as a core message. And the idea being that no matter who it is, if it's a kid in the audience at a local elementary school, or at the or for the president at the White House, like I always like to say, I'm a human trying to connect to another human, essentially, and that's where we find our power.
That is something we should all strive for.
Absolutely, and it takes the nerves out of it as well, because then we're not trying to prove ourselves so much as trying to share something with another person or a group of people.
I think you've even mentioned there was a view in which Yo-Yo Ma would invite his guests, or would pretend his audience were his house guests.
Yeah, so Yo-Yo Ma has always been a huge influential figure for me, not only because he's a great cellist, but humanitarian and just so good with, I like to always say, the alchemy of words. And he was saying that the idea of when he plays in a concert hall, for instance, or just any general performance, he likes to feel like the audience is our guests at his house. And what he's doing is showing them a form of hospitality, getting up the fine china and making sure that everyone feels welcome. But this entire idea of everyone in the house who are spending time together, they're all coming in on an equal playing field. There is no performer at the top and then listeners on the bottom. We're all working together to create a community that makes us feel more whole through sharing a sense of culture, whether it be through the cello or any art form. So I've always tried to sort of think about it like that. This idea of music as a form of generosity, something that we continue to strive to cultivate, because it takes a long time to put together a piece of music. But once we have it there, it really is meant to be just shown around and enjoyed by everyone.
Yeah, you're right. And you know what they say, your fine china brings in the best guests.
Yeah, it's always good to crack out the fine china more often than we probably should. Or do, I should say.
Yeah, maybe you should have a living room concert on Zoom, and we can all bring our Royal Albert to the concert.
A virtual tea party. It sounds great.
When is it?
Yeah, exactly.
So I was also wondering, what is it like to have multiple roles as a violinist, educator, and world advocate for disability and the arts, and what led you to these roles?
So I think that it's interesting how we always say that we put on these different hats based on where we are, and sometimes I think what gets lost is sort of like the synthesis of that within sort of the whole person, because I don't think that my advocacy work excludes any of my performative work, for instance, or my teaching as an educator. I incorporate a lot of the advocacy work into that as well. I think that, however, it all centers around mission. And I think that's sort of what ties it together. This idea of being able to provide access and inclusion for people with disabilities to make music together in a group like an orchestra. And I think that's something that has come very personal to me, because I've experienced it firsthand growing up and how it's benefited my life. So growing into those roles, I think it was a lot through just taking a leap. I remember doing a lot of work as a performer right after finishing my undergrad, and it was very, I don't want to make it seem boring, just typical. Like I was going on tour and playing a concert and then leaving afterwards and promoting such beautiful art, and yet I felt like there was something missing still, and something that wasn't utilizing sort of where I wanted to make an impact in the world. So at a certain point, I took a year off and just reevaluated my life. I went back to Toronto and was with my family and said, well, what's the next step? And ended up applying for education, like a very academic field compared to performance. And it was very interesting because, you know, I'd been playing pretty much up until then, and I was like studying again, like things that I hadn't since high school. I had to take the GRE in order to apply to Harvard, for instance, and I spent a lot of time on the qualitative side of it, I remember, and I knew that maybe I shouldn't say this out loud, but I will. Harvard wasn't really concerned about my math skills going into education. So the score cutoff was lower, so I spent no time on that. And I remember taking the test, and I had, you know, a billion synonyms for, you know, one concept. And then I got to the math section and basically just like filled it out at random, and somehow got at least, you know, 50%. I was like, you knew that it was not a good thing where I was like 98th percentile in qualitative and somehow like 50th percentile in math. It's like you clearly strategized how to get into Harvard, and I was like, yeah, sure. So that might be the secret: know how to play the game and then go from there. No, I shouldn't say that. It really is about mission and really how you want to impact the world, and that's what I did. So I finished my graduate work in education, and then led a program right out of graduation, an El Sistema inspired program in Boston at a school called Conservatory Lab Charter School. And then, did that for a few years and have been sort of going strong in the education world ever since.
That's amazing. You must have a lot of discipline to have gone through education so many times.
But it's been fun. I mean, I think that the nice thing about playing music, like the violin, it's like if you can learn, you know, the Paganini Caprices, for instance, it's the same discipline set. It's like in some ways, like I like attending to very difficult pieces because it makes all the grunt work, like the office work that I do these days, a lot more manageable. Because it's just access is this part of the brain that's uncomfortable, and so long as you align it with, just like in playing, like you're doing the work to make beautiful music or the world a more beautiful place. It's the same with like your grant applications as well as an administrator, or like figuring out schedules for the kids. You go through this discomfort in order to hopefully provide something positive for the students that you serve.
Mission. Speaking of grunt work, as a chair of Milton Academy, what are your goals?
So I think that listening is a huge component to all education, but in particular music education. We have to figure out where the students are right now in terms of how they're perceiving and how they're making music, and figure out how we can diversify our programming in order to help every student have their own voice, essentially, and to have that honored and celebrated as well. We're unpacking a lot in terms of, like, you know, how do we deliver instruction and music education in the COVID world, and at the same time, how do we promote the sense of anti-racist education in classical music, where we do see this, and we have to confront this uncomfortable fact that it is rooted in white supremacy, essentially. How do we grow and how do we accept that for what it is and continue to grow with a degree of humility that allows us to not only survive but evolve in a way that will allow us to thrive years from now?
Absolutely. That's a really important question to ask and issue to address, especially with all that's going on in the world today. I mean, Vancouver, it's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the world is a complex place, and music should, and all art has to hold a mirror up to that complexity if it's to find meaning and relevance with the listener, in our case. So there's a lot of work to be done, not only sort of on the educator side, the student sides, but the performer side as well. I think it's important as we sort of address issues of systematic racism to think institutionally, and at the same time there is the power of individual voices within these institutions to provide a sense of compelling narrative to continue fueling the inevitable sustainable work that needs to be done.
Can you give me more of an example of what white supremacy looks to you, especially in the music world?
Well, I think that you can probably just think to the canon, not the Pachelbel canon, of course, which was by a white male composer.
I was thinking of that.
Yes, but even within our education system, most of our pieces are not only composed by people who are white from a very specific time in Europe, but also male as well. So there's also this white male supremacy, and it's all amazing, beautiful music in its own right. But I think that just like we've seen in a lot of discussions around classical music, we can easily get stuck and sort of boxed into it. I think also because if you're sort of being introduced to classical music, the first thing you might want to hear is Beethoven 5. And there's no problem with that, but I think that if you see it from a completely sort of purely sort of monetary value, and you're just saying, okay, well, let's just pump out the classes, the things that we know sells, it's what type of business model are you creating? That you're always giving the old product, whereas everything else and all these people are sort of growing and evolving around you. You can't depend on your endowments in perpetuity in order to sustain your work. There is room for addressing sort of this miracle of what ties us together as human beings over the past hundreds of years through this art form of Western classical music. But there's so much more that we can do, and we have done. It's just how do we amplify those sort of new works by composers who represent a diverse background? How do we promote educated systems where we have more orchestral musicians of color in our symphony orchestras, for instance? Because the talent is there, we just need to figure out ways to amplify that. Representation matters in the end, and the more that we can figure out systematically how to amplify diverse voices, the more we'll survive as a cultural field.
Yeah, I really agree with creating that awareness and the openness that really needs to happen, especially today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as I was saying, it has to happen in sort of crisis as much as it has to happen in sort of non-war times, if you want to call it that. It's just you have to sustain the work in a way that I don't know, it's a constant stretch. But I think as human beings, we're meant to sort of be uncomfortable in order to grow, and we have to get used to it and acknowledge that it's okay.
You're absolutely right. You have to be uncomfortable. You have to address these issues, even if it makes your neighbor uncomfortable. It's important to bring that awareness to the world.
Absolutely.
So my next question is, being in the position of both student and teacher, and from your experiences, how should we approach teaching and educating others?
So I think, again, it's thinking of becoming students of the learners, of the people that you're serving. I always like to say that you don't necessarily start with where you want the student to be or what that destination is, because the student will define that in some capacity, and that should be a joint project. But you start with where the student is first, and work your way around that. And that really means attending to what the students' goals might be, what they find engaging, what brings them sustained passion in what they do. Because in the end, without the motivation, or I shouldn't say that, if you're only motivated by the fear factor alone, innovation can't happen. And I think that we're sort of in this progressive 21st century model in which we don't need only people to do sort of the task, but we need them to do something that is uniquely theirs, because you're the only person who has your own perspective. And if that's the case, you bring a new idea into the world that can fuel an economy that serves everyone in the end. So I think that education is such a broad term, and yet those are sort of the very general places that I start, independent of the arts. That being said, like, there is a lot that the arts can teach us about education, sort of this idea of approaching your classroom like a piece of music. You know, I always like to say that there are no unimportant notes in like a score, for instance, as much as there are no unimportant kids in the classroom. So you have to really attend to everyone in order to create sort of this narrative that feels compelling. There's this sense of being able to project, again, it's like your power comes not from you being just you from the internal sense, but also projecting who you are to the furthest places at the end of a concert hall. You know, if we can sort of metaphorically reach a student who might be completely different than us, then we have been able to create a sense of not necessarily replication in education, but transformation.
Absolutely. It's really important that we be open and receptive of people's needs in order to serve them.
Absolutely.
I really love your metaphors, by the way. They're amazing.
That's all we do as musicians, right?
With teaching, right? So, what would you tell young musicians who are like-minded and striving to be like you or pursue even a similar career path to yours?
I think that the younger generation is more conscious than even my generation growing up. We always say that, you know, kids are continually better than the elders, and I think I'm no exception. I do take tremendous hope from the actions of our kids, and I think that technology has played an interface. Like messaging can be so much more quickly disseminated, to be able to sort of outline what might be large social problems, for instance. The kids can really see in an accessible way. There's less shielding for kids, and I think that while technology can sort of provide problematic nature to, like, you know, having misinformation spread, I think a lot of kids have really engaged with a social consciousness collectively that combined with the skills they have, like if you're thinking about a musician who's like learning to play the violin, there's a lot that they'll be able to do to push the agenda forward in a way that makes the world a better place. I think that one of the things that is tricky with young kids is just how high the expectations are there for them, and the amount of things that they need to accomplish. Like their schedules are packed. They have, you know, their athletics, they have their academics, they have their arts, and it can be overwhelming and over stimulating for some kids. So those who are sort of socially active and minded, I mean, I think that it's really understanding how to balance your life and how to, again, create sustainable change through taking care of yourself. To say it's okay to take a breath from here and there, because generally classical musicians, and this generalizing, of course, like the perfectionists in nature. Like you can't play the Tchaikovsky violin concerto ambitiously without thinking I'm going to get every single note, sort of deal. And I definitely was no exception, and I'm sure that there are young kids that are like that too. It's like, but in that striving for perfection, to say it's okay to fail, and your mistakes and how you grow from them are what really push you forward in a way that help you practice that discomfort that we were talking about. And the more that kids can find that within themselves, to find that centralized mission that really makes them feel impactful, the more that'll be their guiding star. I have no worries of where they are. Hopefully we're just paving the way for them in terms of like just creating institutions or programs that they can eventually fill into as leaders, or create new ones as well. So I'm excited to see where they go.
Yeah, well, as an educator, you do sort of hold the future.
Yeah, and the impact is one that you don't really see right away. It's like not an overnight process. And I think that's why it's sometimes difficult for people to feel like, oh, we need to invest in education, because it doesn't ever seem like it's ever the crisis point. It's really the investment that you put in now, that 20, 30 years down the line, you're sort of creating a generation of human beings that will, again, positively impact the world. But that's sort of, economies of faith rather than economy of crisis.
Yeah, that is true. Speaking of perfectionism, I know the Tchaikovsky is impossibly difficult, but when you do nail that passage, it really feels good.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a sense of like scaling the mountain and really just enjoying the view for a little bit is so important. I don't know where it goes from there. I think it's like the terrain going up, and sort of like maybe what happens, you go back down and then you just climb another mountain, or you go to the same mountain but take a different path, sort of deal. But that is sort of a continual life process that I love, and I like the idea of like, seeing a mountain, you're going to climb it, sort of deal. It keeps us engaged for sure.
Definitely. So is the next stop the Himalayas for you?
So I heard an encore on social media of Zimmerman playing Rachmaninoff Prelude on the violin, and I think a few hours later I ordered the sheet music, and that'll be the next mountain to climb since it's the summertime. It's nice to be able to engage in that, and just small projects along the way. I like, my daily routine is I wake up, run with my dog, get a cup of coffee, and then just practice, then shower. And it's a great way, like it's like bulletproof almost, in terms of like just getting everything engaged as you continue the rest of your day.
That is a really nice way to start the day.
Yeah, you just need to wake up at 6, so that's no big deal.
It's doable. It's not the most fun, but it is doable.
Yeah, especially when your dog wakes you up at 6 anyway, so that's what happens.
I can attest to it. I have to.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do it for them.
Definitely. So, speaking of sustainability, what are your thoughts on the classical music scene today, and what measures can we take to sustain the arts?
Yeah, again, I think that the idea of sustainability does not equate preservation. I think it means innovating and pressing forward. I think that as we sort of think about sustainability, it's almost very evolutionary in a way. Like, how do we sustain ourselves as a species? We adapt in the end, and the world is such a different place than it was 50 years ago, which is why sometimes I do hesitate to say, well, this is the golden age and this is not, sort of deal, because I think that we're sort of in this continual process of creating something new as an artist, and as a collection of artists sort of embedded under sort of this cultural engine that supports the world in a way. So I think it really is, again, confronting elements of discomfort and really being fearless. I think it's so easy to think sustainability and equate that to financial sustainability as well. But once you sort of tie it in completely to sort of the monetization aspect, you sort of lose this very organic transaction of expressing ideas to another person that in itself creates its intrinsic value. And through that intrinsic value, you hope to be able to create, some type of scalable business model around. But the idea sort of has to come first. And I think that we obviously need to start with people who are currently in the profession, my generation, and then we have to continue teaching, these skills to our kids as well. So it really is something in which everyone has to do their part and everyone has to get involved. And I think that, we're in this crisis on many fronts right now. So this is probably more so than any other time, the opportunity to really, we always say that change requires some dismantling. And well, we're already dismantled in some capacity, but not by our own choice. So how do we rebuild? And how do we build in a way that reflects a better future?
Well, that being said, how can we rebuild, especially bringing in the cultural diversity and openness to society?
Well, I think that there are a lot of engines involved in that. I think that part of it is literally that leap of faith. Like, how will performers come back and feel safe? For instance, how will educators want to go back into classrooms and teach orchestra, for instance? So rebuilding requires an act of faith. Like, how are we going to get our audiences back into the concert hall after being traumatized from this experience, even if it is safe? How do we get teachers back into the classroom teaching orchestra, for instance, these large groups, in a way that allows us to sort of influence the next generation? So I was having a conversation with a fellow music educator this morning, and we're talking about strategy and strategy always being sort of this evaluation of risk. And we were just talking about what are the risks of not doing anything at all? Well, maybe people will be healthier and safer, but the risk of leaving people behind from an equity perspective, like people with disabilities, students of color, people who are from a wide variety of cultural, socioeconomic circumstances, these things present as much of a long-term risk as trying to protect your short-term interests as well. So it really, again, we have to think in a very long-term perspective and know that in this rebuilding process, while yes, we can create things in the way that we want, it's something that's going to take a long time. It's always going to continually sort of renew itself. I think that we'll probably have to do it a little bit faster though,
Yes.
which means a little bit less sleep for everyone involved. But if you're driven by the mission, I think that, life is meant to be, or anything worth pursuing is worth struggling a little bit over.
That is very well said. Everything is hard. It's not where we get to, but the journey that matters, right?
Yeah, I mean, anything's going to be hard, so you may as well make it hard and drive it with a purpose.
Absolutely. So, I'm just wondering, what is your regimen in preparing for concerts, speaking of journey?
Yeah, so I think that anytime that you look at a new piece of music, it always starts with the information that you're given, which is the sheet music. And I always like to see scores as almost topography. It's like you're given a map, and you see the mountains, you see sort of the distances between the notes. There is this level of abstraction as you get older that becomes very beautiful when you see something that looks like just dots and lines into something that feels very colorful and vibrant, and gives you a tremendous degree of detail and resolution at the same time. So I think my first thing is really just translating whatever is on that map into literally what is the motor cortex of the brain. Like, how do you execute these notes? How do you play them in tune? How do you sort of understand the relationship of the rhythms? How do you sort of attend to articulation, dynamics, like all these things? And as sort of that process goes, there's sort of this concurrent process that's happening in which you're, say for instance, you're mapping these things out. Oh, the tree's there, the pathway there is leading to that side. Then you start seeing patterns, or you sometimes see a lack of patterns that can be jarring and expressive in their own ways too. I think that music is always an interplay of setting up expectations and then subverting them. There is like such a universal appreciation for humans, at least, well, hopefully, for this like delightful surprise, and that happens in music all the time. So how do you sort of amplify those things? How do you remain in a state of wonder, and how do you sort of iterate in a way that allows you to sort of deepen that emotional capacity so that you can translate that to a listener? Because what we do is so abstract in a way, and the way that artists have to express has to be even more dynamic and forceful in a way, because everything gets diluted between the air to the next ear. So how do you use your technique? How do you use your body to be able to really accentuate, elongate, and yet at the same time, like really understand when there is reason to have restraint as well. Restraint can be such a beautiful art form too. So there's a lot to discover in that process, and I think that getting older is like less time to just perform. It's really about maximizing sort of the iterative process so that it's efficient. I used to be like stop and go, and this sort of this feedback loop, and now it's like really figuring out the pauses and how to use them well. Like a great piece of music, we need rests, and I think there is like a value to like taking space for oneself, not only in the process of learning a piece of music, but in life as well.
Thank you for sharing your words of wisdom.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you tell me about your recent and upcoming projects?
So, because everything has moved remote, I remember my last concert was in Iowa, and it was like early March. And I remember like watching the news and like just like, oh, I should be more careful on airplanes, sort of deal. Little did I know that was going to be the last time that I was going to be playing for, I'm guessing maybe the rest of the year in person. So everything's moved online, and again, it's like really seeking a way to figure out how we can use our gifts to be able to help. So I'm a musician. I can express something that might give us a more holistic sense of where we're going through from an emotional perspective. Just a lot of recordings. I've been sending them to hospitals for patients, staff, administrators of the healthcare system. We've been doing some education shows for kids who might need some summer programming, and just like saying yes to as many things as possible if people need music in some way. And that is an interesting conversation topic, because I think that some in my field think that if you're giving away for free, you're making it valueless. But yeah, I think it's the opposite. I think that, you know, when you hear of like, you know, restaurants delivering food to the healthcare workers for free, essentially, we are so integral to the functioning and continual sustainability of society, not only to help in the healing process, but to also record, you know, this time. Like when we think about, you know, art from the time of the Spanish flu, for instance, in the 1910s, it's like these are testaments and documents that sort of enliven history. So we're in the middle of it right now. And what we say and what we do will have an impact for generations to come.
You're absolutely right. I think what you're doing is amazing, especially since we have all these essential workers that are working day and night for us, and they are human too. They need that love and appreciation, and, you know, sharing your music with them, I think that holds tremendous value.
Yeah, so definitely, like, I don't know how it is for a lot of other musicians, but I think that there's so much to do. And I hope that, you know, as we're sheltering in place and, you know, people are sort of saying, well, we can't perform in concert halls anymore, there are a lot of other ways that we can continue to help.
You're right. Speaking of creating these projects, how do we create action in musical education, especially in our location or even globally?
I think that sometimes, like when I'm playing a piece of music, for instance, what drives action is a deadline. Like, you have to have a sense of urgency to what you do. You have to say, if not now, when? And then you have to sort of take the risk of, like, say I'm playing a piece of music, I could go through like the little tiny sections over and over again, like feel safe in like structuring that, but sometimes you just have to play the entire piece through and just like fail, you know. And I think that is one of the big things that we need to embrace as practitioners in education, or those who support it, to support this idea that, you know, it's not just fueling success, it's fueling the acceptance of failure so that you can grow. Because I think that the antithesis to action is paralysis, and paralysis is often something that results in overcomplicating things and being fearful of not doing the right thing. So yeah, it's not to say that fear will ever leave, but just to understand that the mission of what you do is more important than fear.
You're absolutely right. It's really important to be vulnerable for the greater good.
Yeah.
That being said, how would you celebrate Canada Day?
So I don't know exactly what I'm doing yet. It's a couple days away, but I think that luckily fireworks can be observed at a social distance. It is always good to just reflect on sort of the country and its history. I think it was Hassan Minhaj who said that in order for us to own the successes of our country, we also have to own its failures as well. And I think that's so important, like, you know, as immigrants or representing sort of this diversity of culture, that we also understand that our benefits have to be translated to giving in some way to help others. So I think it's great to have some time to pause and reflect on that, and just take a breath and just sort of be still with that thinking. And then I have some books on tap, just like beer. I have some Emerson essays. I have a sort of rom-com book, and then one that talks about sort of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict through music. So just sort of circling around those books, and I might just go from one to another as necessary. But I think it's going to be a nice day, and definitely outdoors.
Sounds like your Pilsner to your Pale Ale.
Exactly.
Fine Scotch, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Definitely. Maybe you could even play the national anthem for your neighbors.
Yeah, hopefully my neighbors will appreciate. You never know.
I'm sure they will.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's definitely an easy one. And Canadian national anthem it's a nice one. It starts off, actually, it's one of the first national anthems that starts with what we call a deceptive cadence. So it starts with this sense of anticipation of the chord, and then it's immediately a minor chord, and yet somehow it transforms itself into major. So there's so many metaphors as a music geek that I like to appreciate about it.
Yeah, especially when you teach your students intervals, minor third is O Canada.
Absolutely. Yep. Minor. Who would have known? But sometimes hope is born out of sadness.
That is true. That is true. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your time. It was really great to have you here today.
Absolutely.
And for those of you who are watching and tuning in, thank you. After this, there will be a wonderful performance of Adrian, so you don't want to miss that. Please enjoy, and don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.